Hello and welcome everyone who is tuning in to our webinar today called Talking About Whiteness, Racial and Ethnic Minorities in Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia. My name is Roman Utkin. I teach at Wesleyan University. My research interests lie in diaspora studies and queer studies. I recently edited a thematic cluster of articles on Russian culture and society in the age of the so-called gay propaganda law, and it just came out in the Russian Review. And I will be the moderator of today's meeting. And I would like to first start by expressing many thanks and gratitude to Zsuzsanna Magdo and her colleagues at the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies at the University of Pittsburgh for putting together the Race in Focus series and for all the work they do to make our field a better, more inclusive intellectual space. Regarding today's panel, it is probably safe to say that most of our colleagues in Slavic, East European, and Eurasian studies recognize that the region and regions we study are ethnically complex and diverse. And yet, if we look at our field from the Anglo-American perspective, both the field and the scholarship it produces appear to be overwhelmingly white. On the one hand, that's likely empirically accurate. However, what does whiteness actually mean in application to the region we call Cs? Many of us who are minorities in the region become white in the US, but some do not. So when is a focus on whiteness illuminating, and when does it obfuscate other minoritizing processes? Which terms and frameworks need to be translated and recalibrated to make whiteness not only a useful unit of analysis, but also a legible one? As I'm sure most of you know, in Russian, the term Caucasian is semantically different from what it means in English. Caucasian, meaning a person from the Caucasus, is far from racially neutral in Russia. And parenthetically, I would add that for the troubling history of the term Caucasian and its roots in one German scholar's fascination with Circassian and Georgian skulls, you can read Nell Irvin Painter's The History of White People. So then the general idea for this panel is to interrogate the semantic complexity of whiteness in order to highlight the ways in which various ethnic minorities in Eastern Europe, Russia, and Eurasia were and continue to be subjected to the racist logic of human hierarchy. Today's speakers, and we have 4 speakers today, they'll talk about the history of eugenics and constructions of race in East Central Europe, about the discourses surrounding migration to the Russian Far East, the discrimination of Uyghurs in China, and the uses of Islamophobic rhetoric in Poland. Although we will not specifically discuss the cultures of Black East Europeans today, next session of the Race in Focus series will be on the responses to the Black Lives Matter movement in Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia. And that event will take place next Friday, February 26th at 2 p.m. Eastern. As for today's conversation, each speaker will have about 10 minutes to share their research and perhaps reflections on their teaching and positionality in the field. We will then move on to an open discussion where you will be able to ask questions by submitting them via the Q&A function in the Zoom window. We're lucky to have our presenters today, and given the range of topics and expertise present in our Zoom session, my hope is that we will approach whiteness in Cs as a keyword, understood in the sense of keywords project initiated by Raymond Williams. Williams identified and investigated socially prominent words such as art, media, or society that are capable of bearing interlocking yet sometimes contradictory and commonly contested contemporary meanings. So with that, let us begin to elucidate some of these interlocking yet contradictory meanings of whiteness. And our first speaker is Marius Turda, who is the director of the Center for Medical Humanities and professor in 20th century Central and East European biomedicine and Oxford Brookes University in the UK. Originally from Maramuresh in northern Romania, Professor Turda has been teaching at Oxford Brookes since 2005. He is the founding director of the Cantemir Institute at the University of Oxford from 2012 to 2013. He's the founder of the Working Group on the History of Eugenics and Race, established in 2006. He's a member of Academia Europeana, fellow of the Royal Historical Society, and fellow of the Galton Institute. He has published extensively on the history of race and eugenics in East Central Europe, with a particular focus on Hungary and Romania. He is the general editor of the 6-volume series, A Cultural History of Race. And at the present moment, he is completing a book on scientific racism in interwar Hungary. So without any further ado, Professor Turda, the Zoom window is all yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Roman, for this wonderful introduction and for the way you framed the discussion. I'm very pleased indeed to be part of this series and to contribute humbly with my expertise and to share with you some of my views on this very difficult, complex, and indeed big topic. Now, to attempt to do justice to the discussion of race, eugenics, and whiteness in East Central Europe in 10 minutes would be a Sisyphic task. And I can't say I would be able to do it, although I have tried in the past. I can't say I haven't, and I failed miserably. So as a result, and for the sake of the conversation, to which I look forward, I would rather just stay within the time allocated to me, but at the risk of saying rather general things than more punctuated, detailed analysis of certain things. Also, because the region is big and composed, as you know, or number of traditions and languages, and to go one by one would require a kind of artistry that hopefully will be done another time. Now, the debate about whiteness in East Central Europe, as you all know, is met with resistance from the local historiographies. And I want to highlight this point because, of course, we have a conversation about whiteness in the West, in America or Britain, and the conversation in the region is completely different. So that's very important. How much actually are we engaging with the local historiography there, with the local historians, with the dominant narrative, with the national vulgate that dominates the conversation? And these historians and political scientists and scholars from the region, whether they are endorsing a certain political ideology or supporting a particular government or not, they are voicing egregious methodological and terminological objections to the critique of whiteness that we're proposing, and by extension to terms such as coloniality or decolonization. Last year, when we witnessed a tremendous movement in America and in Britain in support of the Black Lives Matter, of course, there were attempts in Budapest or in Warsaw or in Bucharest to initiate a similar movement, and the reaction from the public and from the official narrative was simply that we didn't have slaves, we didn't have colonies, so the entire conversation is misplaced. So this is one of the recurrent arguments that is used by local historiographies in this rather one-sided conversation. You know, Poles or Hungarians or Romanians or Croats didn't have colonies. So there is no need to decolonize Polish history or Hungarian or Romanian history. Now, of course, this week we commemorate 165 years of the abolition of slavery in Romania. So we do know that that is factually incorrect. There were Roma slaves for 5 centuries in the Danubian principalities of Moldova and Wallachia, and they were only emancipated in the middle of the 19th century. But when the discussion is put into these terms, and these are the terms which form, in a way, much of the conceptual backbone of the discussion about whiteness in the West, it is in connection to colonial empires, it is in connection to slavery. There is little echo in East Central Europe from the official national traditions. And this is, and that's my first argument, and maybe a contagious one, this is not because whiteness is not an important issue in the local tradition. It's because, I argue, whiteness is not critiqued within the world it inhabits. And I should like to illustrate that argument with 2 points. One relates to the history of race and racism, and the other one relates to the history of eugenics. These are 2 main areas to which I contributed in my scholarly work, and these are the topics I teach at the university. Now, of course, to discuss the entire constellations of race and race ideas formulated in the region since the middle of the 19th century to the present day, it's impossible. But I should like to highlight something that, and I'm very pleased that Roman highlighted that, what he called the semantic complexity. And that's something that is really, really crucial when it comes to discussing the issue of race and whiteness in the region. Because, of course, the local languages present certain problems. If you can't really understand the nuances used by the racist language in a particular culture, the possibility you have is, of course, to use a terminology that's familiar to you, the terminology we use in the West, and then try to apply it to phenomena that happened there. And of course, that's not only problematic, but also sometimes it's completely unnecessary, because there is a local language of race and there is a local racist language. But of course, you have to get to the intricacy of that particular construction. In the region, in East Central Europe, the debates on race were connected to a much bigger debate, of course, which is essential to the cultures of these regions, which is the debate about national character, the debate about national specificity. What is a Hungarian? What is Romanian? What is a Pole? So these debates about national character and how you identify and define that codified particular linguistic and conceptual formulae or expressions, if you want, which they, in turn, they did 2 things. On the one hand, they anchored this debate about national character to historical genealogies, which were very prestigious. I mean, if you think of the Sarmatians in Polish history, if you think of the Mongols or the Huns in Hungarian mythologies and national history, if you think of the Romans for the Romanians, if you think of the Goths for the Croats during the 1940s. So that's one direction. The other direction, of course, it created a very complex system of belonging and acceptance. To give you one example, in Hungarian, for instance, you have got about 6 or 7 ways of using race in relation to nation, nationality, ethnic group or ethnicity, in connection to religion, in connection to social class. So as a composed word, you would have 7 or 8 constructions within the same text or the same speech or the same conversation, in which, of course, you have to know exactly when the word race signifies the nation, signifies the ethnic group, signifies the Catholics, signifies the Protestants or the Calvinists, signifies the Roma. You wouldn't be able to guess that unless you engage in this semantic hermeneutical exercise, if you wish, a bit of acrobatics, conceptual and philosophical. You also have very important words that describe the purity of the nation, the racially pure Hungarians, for example, and they have expression, they relate to the blood but they also have expression that relate to the color, by which, of course, is meant the white Hungarian. So you use the expression of the pure Hungarian in terms of being the white Hungarian. And of course, I want to highlight this important element because, and this is one example, and it works across the region. This is not something that happened recently, and that's my point. This is something that already started in the 19th century. So when the debates on national identity and the debates on the nation began, so to understand whiteness in East Central Europe, you actually have to understand how the local tradition, how the discussion about national identity, how whiteness becomes in a way the normative element of national identity. So that's one very important argument. We need to be aware of the local history of race and racism. We also have to understand how interlocked, that intertwined that concept and conceptualization of the particular group, be that the Hungarians or the Poles or the Croats or the Romanians, is within the internal debate about what constitutes the nation. And that's not easy to grasp. It requires, in many ways, certain archaeological skills, and I use the term, slightly Foucauldian terms, that kind of archaeology of the traditions of knowledge, onto which then debates about whiteness, namely identity, are being based. So that's one tradition. The second one, as I mentioned earlier, relates to the history of eugenics. Now, I would argue that if we want scholars and educators in East Central Europe to see race, to see race again in many ways, demands that we bring forth the history of eugenics in that region. Of course, this is being done in the United States, and it's being done in Britain. We have this understanding that having access to the history of eugenics, we can understand in many ways how whiteness was formulated, codified, normalized, both as a component of national identity, but also in a way as a prism through which very important categories that formulate and then construe the definition of identity were presented. If you think of what is to be fit, the idea of fitness, what is to be normal, what is to be an active citizen, citizenship, the whole discussion about citizenship in Eastern Europe, who's the citizen and what rights it deserves, had very important correlations to both the history of race and the history of eugenics. And if we look at the interwar period, when this develops strongly, we could see how that works, not only in relationship to the Jews. The Jews are not quite as white as the others, certainly in relationship to the Roma. But then I would like to venture even more into the recent times and say, if we look at socialism and the socialist period in Eastern Europe, you could see immediately how relevant a knowledge of the history of eugenics might be when you try to understand the construction of whiteness as a normative component of national identity. So as I'm approaching slightly the end of the time allocated to me, I should like to say one more thing, if I may. A set of racial articulations form the intellectual core, I would argue, of the project of modernity in East Central Europe. So there's the third element I want to bring here, which needs to be problematized. Sorry, it's been a long day here. And then exposed. So if we really want to expose what's at the core of the project of modernity in East Central Europe, you ought to be able to crisscross and to bring forth and then to analyze it comparatively, to have to bring forth the history of race and the history of eugenics together. And then to formulate it within the important debate for the region, which is a debate on the national character and debate on national identity. In this case, then it's very difficult for any local tradition to object to your internal criticism of whiteness, because you are doing it from within the tradition rather than from outside the tradition. And it's very easy for them to say, well, obviously you don't really understand what you're talking about because you don't understand our local tradition. So it's a simplified argument, I know, but I put it there as a way to express, a way of articulating a conversation. So this revision of the national canons and of the national ethnopedagogies that have been going on in Eastern Europe since the middle of the 19th centuries ought to involve a reworking of the concept of race, but not as something imposed from the outside necessarily, but something which is internal, which they themselves struggle to formulate, have problems identifying, is difficult to cope with its limitations. Nevertheless, notwithstanding that process, they do in the end formulate it. They do implicitly and explicitly base it on the idea that they are white, they are Europeans, they are the last bastion of culture, or defending Western civilization, as the Poles would say, or the Hungarians or the Croats. So that is part and parcel not only of the development of what is national history, what is national literature, what is national philosophy in those countries, but also what is national identity. So to this end, rethinking of the concept of whiteness in the context of the local and the national traditions is in order. Thank you very much. I hope I stay within my time, Ron.
Thank you, Marius. And we will, I encourage participants, and not so much participants as the audience members, so to speak, to type in questions into Q&A as those questions come up, so that will give a little bit more time for the speakers to articulate the answers. But now we are moving on to our second presenter, who is Lauren Woodard. And Lauren is a postdoctoral associate and a lecturer in Russian, East European, and Eurasian studies at the Macmillan Center at Yale University. Her research interests are migration governance, national identity, diasporas, and borders. And trained as a cultural anthropologist at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, her research focuses on migration, race, and national identity in Russia. Based on 13 months of ethnographic field work conducted among government officials and immigrants in Russia, her book project, The Politics of Return, examines tensions between exclusion and inclusion in Russia's migration policies. So, Lauren, please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Susanna and Roman, for organizing this panel today. I very much have enjoyed following the University of Pittsburgh and AC's Race and Focus series this fall and now spring, and I'm excited for our conversation today. So I prepared some brief comments about how I've been thinking about race, and in particular whiteness, in my research and teaching, as well as some reflections on my positionality within the field. First of all, as an anthropologist, I think it's important to note that I'm interested in discourses as well as practices. And how I'm approaching race is especially informed by recent work in linguistic anthropology, particularly Jonathan Rosa and Nelson Flores's work that looks at how ideas of race and language are intertwined historically and presently. So this work is coming primarily out of the American context, but I believe this framework can apply to the Russian and Soviet case as well. And in my work, I'm utilizing this ratiolinguistic perspective alongside work by Vera Tols, Francine Hirsch, Alina Lemon, and Madeline Reeves to think about how ideas of race, ethnicity, and language are at play within Russia's migration policies. And specifically, I'm examining how ratiolinguistic contextual markers such as skin color, eye shape, clothing, family size, and accent, to name just a few, come together in a set of signs to index belonging. And to think about some of these issues and questions that I'm thinking about right now, I'm going to give some examples from my book project. My book project, tentatively titled The Politics of Return, is about Russia's resettlement of Compatriots program and other efforts like the Far Eastern Hector program that seek to attract people to move to the Far East, Russia's region that borders Mongolia, China, North Korea, and Japan. Introduced in 2006, the Compatriots program offers financial assistance and Russian citizenship in as little as 3 months to those willing to move to regions of strategic importance like the Far East. My book is an ethnography of the program, and it's from the perspective of those most involved. And my findings are based on fieldwork, participant observation, and interviews I conducted with the people who are most involved in the program, officials, journalists, and academics in Moscow who design the program and promote the program through various means. The local officials in Primorsky Krai, my field site. And this is at the regional and town level. And the compatriots who obtain citizenship through the program, who are primarily from Ukraine, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Azerbaijan, as well as a few other places. So my book is specifically exploring a tension between how the Compatriots program is promoted and how it is implemented. As Russian officials have sought to limit labor migration through the introduction of quotas and a Russian language exam, they have simultaneously made it easier for some to gain citizenship through the Compatriots program. Online, which is how the program is primarily promoted, it appears to be a Slavic or culturally similar solution to Russia's demographic crisis, and social media posts, videos, forums, and websites that advertise the program depict white ethnic Russian and sometimes German families returning to the Russian homeland. And the program has these images of the homeland and these families. And in recent years, there's also this sense that a lot of the media is highlighting Russian families who went to the West and have come back from Western Europe, the United States, and Canada. However, during my fieldwork in Primorsky Krai, I learned that a diversity of participants qualify, including the targets of recent migration laws, immigrants from Central Asia and the Caucasus. So how do we understand this tension between promotion and implementation that is happening in the Compatriots program? And what does that tension reveal about race in Russia? And I have a few thoughts to share and questions that I'm thinking about. So first, this tension comes out of racialized anxieties about demographic changes in Russia that are intensified in the context of the Far East. Anthropologists Sergei Ushakin and Michelle Rifkin-Fish have analyzed how Russia's aging population and declining birth rates, a trend seen in many European countries as well, have become sensationalized and racialized as a demographic crisis. In the context of the Far East, Primorsky Krai's proximity to China intensifies those fears, so that as I heard during one roundtable among officials in Moscow in 2017, officials worry that the Far East will sink away, quote, like the Titanic, only to be eagerly embraced or seized by China. So the Compatriots program, and in particular the Far East's position as a region of strategic importance in this program, with additional incentives if you move there, has emerged as a solution to those fears. Second, the term compatriot itself is ambiguous and broad. According to Russia's compatriots laws, it includes ethnic Russians, Russian speakers, and those spiritually and culturally tied to the Russian Federation. This is quite a broad term, and other scholars have looked at how this ambiguity and breadth of the term compatriot reflects the diversity of groups and factions involved in negotiating that legal term, not only for ethnic Russians and Russian speakers abroad, but also for non-ethnic Russians within Russia. And in the context of the Compatriots program, I found that this breadth also empowers local officials at the regional and local level to adapt the program to meet local needs. So for to give one example, one official I spent a considerable amount of time with in Primorsky Krai was actively using the Compatriots program to help immigrant populations already living in his city. And this was primarily refugees from Ukraine who had been sent to that town on government planes during the 2014-2015 height of the refugee crisis, and well, framed as a crisis where people from Ukraine were moving to Russia during the war, or they were or people from Ukraine who joined family that they had in Primorsky Krai. And there are also a large number of Tajiks, Uzbeks, and Azeris in the town who were already working there and had been working there for a while and wanted to have some kind of more permanent status rather than applying for work permits. So this one official was using the Compatriots program to help these people. And he was making sure that through the Compatriots program that they would have access to all the state support that they would need. Including if you have a family with a large family, you could have the maternity capital vouchers, et cetera, and get your Far Eastern land hectares. And when he talked about why he was doing this, he often spoke nostalgically of the friendship of peoples from Soviet times and what his city looked like during Soviet times when it was more populated, diverse, and doing better economically than today. And he would emphasize the slogan of Russia's unity is in its diversity and the role that children would play in the city's future. So here we see also Soviet legacies of ideas around diversity that continue to influence how officials are implementing the program today. Another way that race is playing a role in the program is when we look at who is more and less visible in the program and how people are positioned within the program. There are hierarchies of compatriots, the most desired, most culturally similar to ethnic Russians, who are welcomed as our dearest relatives in official statements and in media promoting the program and about the program. And these are terms used to accompany images of ethnic Russian and Ukrainian families returning to Russia. And these terms talk about cultural similarities, which can hide or blur beliefs about racial differences, but can appear as quite obvious when we compare how migrant workers are simultaneously characterized as Black and illegal. And then there are also conversations about family size. So some families are praised, especially the old believers, for having large, many children family, mnogodetny. And this is also the case for ethnic Russians, but then many children can also be this negative characteristic about when people are talking about people coming from Central Asia with many children and large families. So I think though what's important to note about these hierarchies is that they shift, which raises interesting questions about whiteness, which I understand is a structural position. So while ethnic Russian and Ukrainian compatriots seem to be at the top of the compatriots hierarchy, as I found in my fieldwork, even this position is unstable and contested. So in the case of refugees from Ukraine, they were initially welcomed as these culturally similar families who were going to help revitalize Primorsky Krai, but then they too were deemed many children in this negative way and seemed to be asking too much of the Russian state just a couple years later. So finally, to begin to wrap up, it is this last piece, how compatriots navigate this racialized hierarchy and assert claims of belonging, that I'm currently thinking and writing about. How do immigrants respond to assumptions people make about their identities as foreigners, migrants, and compatriots, and these other terms people use? And what practices do they engage in to challenge those assumptions and reconstruct their identities, or at least make those assumptions more difficult to make? And I'm arguing that ethnographic attention to this word choice and behavior, when someone assumes that someone's a foreigner versus a migrant or an illegal, or characterizing one group as uneducated and another as highly qualified, and in using the informal you versus the more respectful you, vui in Russian, to address someone, reveals spaces in which assumptions about cultural similarities and Russianness, cultural differences, and otherness appear. And I'm not just interested in how people read race, though, or place someone within this continuum of belonging, but also how immigrants are responding to and engaging in these various practices to blur and challenge assumptions, to make claims about belonging. So I'm thinking here of efforts to change one's accent, using an ethnic Russian name online on forums and social media, and changing one's clothing to match what locals wear, to name just a few of the practices that compatriots engaged in to assert their belonging and claims as Russian compatriots. So I think I might be out of time, but to wrap it up, I would be happy to also talk more about and reflect on positionality as a white American woman conducting fieldwork on migration in Eastern Russia, if that's of interest to people during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lauren. Yes, I for one would absolutely love to have that conversation, however brief it will be. But with your presentation, we're already in Russia's far east. Our next presenter, Sean Roberts, will, I think we're more or less staying in the region, but moving a little bit south. And then our last presenter will be Monika Bobako, and she will take us back to Eastern Europe. Okay, so our next presenter, Professor Sean Roberts, is an associate professor of the practice of international affairs and director of the International Development Studies program at the George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. Dr. Roberts is an anthropologist who has studied the Uyghur people of China and Central Asia for 30 years, writing his dissertation on the Uyghurs of the China-Kazakhstan borderlands while a PhD candidate at the University of Southern California. He has published numerous articles in academic journals, edited volumes, and in policy-oriented publications about the Uyghurs, and he's the author of the recently published book, The War on the Uyghurs, China's Internal Campaign Against a Muslim Minority, which came out with Princeton University Press in 2020. Sean?
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to participate in this panel, both because it's a very interesting topic and also because I think it's really made me kind of stretch my conceptual thoughts about the situation the Uyghurs are facing. You know, first of all, I guess in the situation the Uyghurs are facing, I think of race more in terms of racial profiling and state violence against groups based on that. And so that I think it informs my understanding of whiteness, but it's a particularly interesting word to use in this particular case because in the People's Republic of China right now, for Uyghurs, I think whiteness really represents Han-ness, the Chinese majority. And for an American or a European going to the region, they would identify the Uyghurs as the white population because they have more kind of European features. When I started thinking about this topic, I decided I wanted to look at it in terms of how our research with marginalized ethnic and racial groups in Eurasia is relevant to the struggle for racial justice in the United States, as well as to the idea of whiteness in the United States. So I'll provide some comments on the situation of Uyghurs inside China, but then I'll also explain where I see this relevancy to situations in the United States. So in my own work, I describe what's happening to the Uyghurs as cultural genocide, which is not meant in any way to deny that it may be outright genocide as designated by those with expertise in international law. It's merely a term I use as an anthropologist because it's something I feel qualified to understand in comparative perspective. In anthropology, cultural genocide is usually associated with the fate of indigenous peoples in the face of settler colonialism. As colonists conquer a land and seek to settle and develop it, according to their wishes and plans, the indigenous people of that land become at best superfluous and at worst an obstacle that must be removed. I would say this is quite accurately describes the situation that that Uyghurs face inside China right now. Their connection to their homeland is being brutally severed. Their group solidarity is being broken by the state, and their identity and culture is actively being erased. And that's also that they do not disrupt the Chinese government's plans for the development of their homeland. So in this way, you know, if we're comparing the situation of the Uyghurs to the racial politics of the United States, the most obvious parallel is that of Native Americans and the cultural genocide suffered by Native Americans. In fact, the parallels are really uncanny, including in the tactics used by the state against these two different groups of indigenous peoples, including displacement from territory, the destruction of solidarity in groups, their depopulation, and attempts at forced assimilation. And I've made the argument in the past, and I think it's a worthy argument, that the Chinese control of the Uyghur homeland is very much like settler colonialism in other contexts. However, when I was researching the period immediately prior to the present crisis facing Uyghurs, I found that for 2 decades, the Chinese state had increasingly profiled the Uyghurs racially as dangerous and extremists. And this allowed for unbridled police brutality being levied against them. And whenever Uyghurs resisted violence from police or other security organs, their resistance was classified as terrorism, which only led to more state violence against them. And this process immediately brought to mind parallels with the contemporary struggle of African Americans. While police brutality in the US may be fueled by racially profiling African Americans as potential criminals, in China, Uyghurs suffer a very similar racial profiling as potential terrorists. So in the Chinese case, this more recently, I think, has reached probably the most extreme stage of racism through a campaign to completely neutralize the Uyghur people as a group, break their solidarity, depopulate them, and destroy their culture. But the events leading up to it are very reminiscent of the relationship between law enforcement and racial minorities in the US. These parallels between the Uyghur situation and racial oppression in the US are important, I think, from an academic point of view. And they tell us about some of the commonalities across states in the racial profiling of marginalized groups that are perceived as culturally different from the majority, especially when those groups have physical features that distinguish them from the majority. While China does not use the term race to describe the different cultural groups within their state boundaries, its treatment of Uyghurs is unmistakably racist in orientation. And I think probably the best indicator of that is that the Chinese state has focused its development of surveillance technology on ways to identify Uyghurs via facial and voice recognition. And this allows security organs and police to literally track every Uyghur in the country as a potential security risk. But I think what I want to kind of finish my comments on is about something else about this comparison. I think what probably the most important aspect of these comparisons between structural racism faced by Uyghurs in China and marginalized racial groups in the US is the potential they have for stimulating global solidarity on issues of racially and ethnically profiled oppression. And this is, my thoughts on this kind of evolved over the last week as I prepared these remarks and went about my usual job of teaching graduate students in development studies. I teach a class on indigenous peoples, ethnic minorities, and development. And this week we read a book called The Politics of Indigeneity, that is framed as a discussion between scholars and indigenous activists from around the world. The book tries to identify a shift in the indigenous peoples movement, which the authors seek to link to the idea of the second wave of feminism. So the idea that as feminists recognized the intersectionality of struggles, became more cognizant of the diversity of the struggles of for women's rights in different parts of the world, and became just more global, it really changed that movement. And the authors of this book were saying that very much like that, we're seeing this happen in the realm of the struggle for indigenous people's rights. And indigenous people's rights are not necessarily the same as the rights of ethnic or racial minorities, but I find these two issues very much intertwined. And it may be another topic for keywords to explore the differences in those different concepts. But in the context of this panel, that made me reflect on the significance of the Black Lives Matter protests in the US this summer. So, in the middle, we can all remember this, in the middle of a pandemic when most people were isolated and in fear, something, remarkable happened. Large protests spread throughout urban America, attracting people across racial, class, ideological lines, all to stand against the structural racism and police brutality faced by African Americans. But I think even more important to the discussion of this panel, and Marius mentioned this briefly, is simultaneously there was solidarity with these protests spreading globally, as throughout Europe, people tore down statues of colonial era leaders who were celebrated in the colonial metropoles, but reviled in the colonies. And there was even instances of Black Lives Matter graffiti appearing in the ghettos of oppressed minorities throughout the world. So it strikes me that this global solidarity with Black Lives Matter is indicative of the commonalities in the struggles faced by ethnic and racial minorities everywhere. And these struggles have long been viewed as marginal, I think, by the global community because they're perceived as being localized and having to do with racial and ethnic relations in the local context. But as an academic who has found himself becoming at least a part-time activist because the people I study are facing impending genocide, I hope the protests in the US this summer are a sign of an emerging second wave in the struggle for racial and ethnic equality that can forge solidarity among oppressed racial and ethnic minorities from around the world, even when acknowledging the vast diversity in the experiences of those people, because in many ways, even if their experiences are very diverse, the roots of their impression are often very shared. And as academics who study the specificities of the struggles of different racial and ethnic minorities in a different part of the world, I think we can play an important role in building that solidarity by trying to inform those facing racial and ethnic injustices in the US of the commonalities they share with others elsewhere who suffer injustices by virtue of their cultural identities. And so finally, I guess to bring this back to the concept of whiteness, part of our role, I think, is showing that whiteness comes in many shades of colors in different contexts, but conceptually, it's always about the imposition of a dichotomy of superiority and inferiority based on ethnic, racial, and cultural differences. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sean. We're now moving on to our fourth and final presenter, Monica Babako, but I would also like to reiterate to those who perhaps maybe are tuning in via Facebook Live stream that you can leave your comments there, and then we will have access to questions through Facebook as well. So, but it is my pleasure to introduce Monika Bobako, who is Associate Professor at the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań, Poland. She holds a PhD as well as a habilitation in philosophy and an MA in gender studies from Central European University in Budapest. She is the author of 2 books. One, Islamophobia as a Technology of Power, a study in political anthropology, and 2, Democracy and Difference, Multiculturalism and Feminism in the Perspective of the Politics of Recognition. She is also the editor of the volumes called The Theologies of Emancipation and Islamophobia, Contexts. Her areas of specialization include political anthropology, critical race theory, post-colonial theory, and religious studies with a special focus on Islam as well as on gender. In 2018, her book Islamophobia was awarded the Jan Długosz Prize and was nominated for the Tadeusz Kotarbiński Prize, which are both major academic awards in Poland. Congratulations on those, Monika, and the Zoom screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Roman, for this kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to this interesting panel. I already feel inspired, as all those topics that appeared are closely linked to my research interests. As you asked me to talk a little bit about my research on Islamophobia and share some insights on how racialization of Muslims has worked in Poland. I would like to refer to that older research of mine on Islamophobia that was finished with this book that you just mentioned, and perhaps try to show in what way this analyzing of Islamophobia has led me to my new research area, which directly relates to the problem of whiteness in the Polish context, because it was like step-by-step, evolution of my thinking about race. So, well, first of all, my research on Islamophobia concerns many different issues, and I will focus just on one area, which is directly related to Polish context, and particularly to a few observations regarding the dynamics of Islamophobic discourses and practices in Poland, which is directly related to the peripheral position of Poland. So this peripherality seems very important in understanding the specificity of this dynamics of Islamophobia, or you can use other terms, semi-peripheral position of Poland, that obviously refers to another set of theories. And I basically mean Immanuel Wallerstein problematization of the center, periphery, semi-periphery system. So basically, well, whenever you try to think about the problem of Islamophobia in Poland, one basic observation that comes to the forefront is the fact that in Poland, we've got very tiny minority, Muslim minority. I mean, it was estimated at the level of less than 0.5% of the population. So some people say around 15, some people say 30,000 people. So statistically insignificant population. Obviously, when those Islamophobic sentiments exploded in Poland, they existed before, but they exploded in the context of refugee crisis 2015. Those people suffered. They were targeted. Individuals and groups suffered, obviously, but that was this consensus between researchers to call this Polish Islamophobia as a kind of Islamophobia without Muslims. Some people use this phrase, Platonic Islamophobia. that basically the strength, the intensity of these anti-Muslim discourses were so strong, and at the same time, those Muslims were imaginary. They did not exist in the time of the refugee crisis. So this particular element, this particular fact of a virtual absence of Muslims, and at the same time, such intensive presence of anti-Muslim discourses that were deployed in Poland, also because the special circumstances, the refugee crisis coincided with the parliamentary elections in Poland, and anti-Muslim fears were heavily, very strongly politicized at this particular time. So that was one of the reasons why it all went so dramatic. But this very fact that you've got very intensive Islamophobia and virtual absence of Muslims basically inspires us to ask questions not so much about the relationship between the relationship that the Polish society established with its Muslim minority, but more about the function and the meaning of the Islamophobic discourses in particular political circumstances. And when I was analyzing this kind of topics, I observed that one thing is pretty obvious. Islamophobic discourses have been articulated from the very different places of the political spectrum. You had different types of Islamophobic discourses. Obviously, in this political context of the refugee crisis, some type of xenophobic, nationalist, conservative Islamophobia dominated the space. But we had also anti-Muslim statements articulated from the liberal side. I analytically divided this Islamophobic discourses into progressivist Islamophobia and conservative Islamophobia. They were very different, but however, they had at least two things in common. One was that obviously Islam was a threat, was something unwanted, other, different, alien, incompatible with Europe. The other thing was that we were supposed to defend Europe against Islam, against coming Muslims. But in fact, in these different types of Islamophobia, both Islam and Europe were in fact empty signifiers that were filled with completely different meanings. So you had those liberal Islamo-skeptics, so to say, who were saying that Europe, this is secularism, democracy, human rights, gender equality, LGBT rights, this kind of things. And Islam, it is everything that opposes this kind of values. So we have to defend secular modern Europe from this Islamic traditionalism, backwardness, lack of respect for women's rights, etc., etc. If you look at this conservative Islamophobia, you see that they perceived Islam as a competing religious universe representing different values opposed to European values that were understood as religious, as based on Christianity, as based on some particular, very separate European heritage. So there were different Islams and different Europes in those kind of discourses. But there was something else interesting, because if you looked at this kind of Islamophobia that dominated the public sphere in Poland, which basically became this official discourse of the ruling party and official discourse of public media in Poland, in fact, there was something more complicated, because there were basically two enemies. One enemy was this Islam associated with refugees that were supposed to come to Poland and destroy Polish identity, Polish culture, etc., etc. But at the same time, the other enemy was Europe, represented by the European Union, by European liberals, by all those people who do not respect Christian heritage, national sovereignty, Polish Catholic tradition, and who impose together with, in the framework of the European Union politics, who impose all those LGBT-friendly regulations, who impose feminism, etc., etc. So this opposition against Muslim refugees that were supposed to come to Poland as part of this European Union regulation regarding the refugees was somehow linked to the opposition to the policy, to European Union in general, and this liberal, modern project of Europeanness that was perceived as, in fact, a form of degeneration of traditional Europe. So we had this, what's more, this kind of Europeanness was narrated as a form of neo-colonialism coming from this liberal or leftist Europe dominated by Germany, and their purpose was to destroy Polish national sovereignty, Polish Catholic identity, and so that was this kind of imaginary. So you had this paradoxical combination of politics, which was Islamophobic, in which you had a package of hatred or fear or hostility to Muslims, to Islam, which was connected with rejection of the liberal, modern European values of gender equality, LGBT rights, etc., etc. Because what was happening and what we can observe now is that these anti-Islamic discourses were followed or were paralleled with another campaign that has taken place in Poland, which is the campaign anti-gender ideology campaign, and now currently anti-LGBT campaign. So I think it is very important to analyze this kind of racialization of Muslims in connection with other campaigns, which are basically part of rejecting, opposing this neo-colonial imposition of the liberal European values. That's what we observe now, this kind of combination. But when I was thinking what it all means, basically, I realized that, yes, I don't want to say that this liberal progressivist Islamophobia was particularly strong, but it existed. You could also see that in the feminist discourses, in liberal press discourses. Obviously, this conservative anti-Muslim discourse was dominant, but there was something interesting in both of them. You could see that both of them basically were the ways in which different political actors basically positioned themselves in relation to the European centers. So you could say that when liberals were saying not nice things about the presence of Muslim minorities and about Islam, they were basically trying to claim that they belong to this European civilization of human rights, of gender equality, secularism, democracy. So to oppose Islam was a way of assimilating to this ideal of Europe, which has its center in the Western Europe, obviously. In case of these conservative Islamophobes, you could see that they also defend some model of Europe, but first of all, they oppose this liberal Europe that they perceive as hostile, as neo-colonial. So they were hostile to Muslims, but this kind of hostility was packed together with some kind of rebellion against European center. So my observation was that if you look at those meanings and functions of the discourses that racialize Muslims, who are virtually absent in our society, you could see that this processes of racialization basically serve something else, that the frame of reference is outside Polish society, that they have this function of positioning Polish society, Polish culture in relation to the European centers. So for this particular reason, this peripheral, okay.
Yes, no, we just, we end at 3:30 and out of respect for everyone's time, I just think it would be great if we could move on to the Q&A. If you just want to say a few words to wrap up your fascinating presentation.
So I just wanted to emphasize that whenever we talk about racialization, and it is also relevant for analyzing what whiteness means in Poland, how it is acted out, what kind of racialization processes take part in constructing this whiteness, we have to take into account this dynamics of peripherality and the fact that it is always related to the center-periphery or center-semi-periphery relationship. And you can really take into account economic factors, you can take into account cultural factors. It is very clearly visible also in the experiences of Polish people who migrated. For example, you see the Poles at the early 20th century in the US. That is a special in-between position in these racial hierarchies. You can see that also at the present day immigration of Poles, let's say to Great Britain. Yeah. Also, again, racialized people who are using racism, who are somewhere in between, who negotiate their whiteness to integrate in receiving society. At the same time, they are racialized and they racialize others. Yeah, and I'm pointing to the fact of the significance of the peripherality in the whole story. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monika, and the entire panel. These were really very illuminating and fascinating presentations. I think first, just sort of to maybe summarize, this has just been resoundingly, you collectively reiterated the fact that race is a social construct. Whiteness has not as much to do with phenotypical characteristics or skin color, but of course is a particular tool of instituting and maintaining hierarchies within societies. And so we have a number of questions. I would like to preemptively apologize if we don't get to answer all of them. And I think there was a number of questions already answered because we had a very quite robust chat situation happening. But Lauren, I think since you volunteered to say a few words about your positionality, and there were a couple of questions concerning teaching specifically, I think a couple of them you've already addressed. One of them had to do with this translatability of whiteness. And of course, whiteness doesn't exist as such, as even on the linguistic level in Russian. We don't say белость, there is белизна, but that's a completely different term. And there was also a question that had to do with the use of pronouns, we versus ты. So if you, Lauren, maybe could comment on that first, and then we'll move on to some next questions.
Sure. So I think, yes, I think the question that someone asked about how I was approaching whiteness, since that coming from an American context, I think is important to highlight. And I think that's also something I'm still thinking about in my work. I'm not necessarily using this framework of whiteness in my work. I'm interested in race, but I'm interested in particular on claims to belonging and how people how different groups are being positioned within Russia's migration policies, and also how those hierarchies of immigrants or migrants shift. So I think in terms of, paying attention to the way people are positioned and how those hierarchies change is kind of one way we can think about whiteness and different as well as difference. So I think the case of the refugees from Ukraine is particularly interesting because while they were initially welcomed as these very culturally similar people to Russians and as like, oh, this is a great solution to the demographic crisis, they speak Russian, they're culturally similar, later on in the conflict, they too there were complaints of the fact that people weren't integrating and that they were perhaps maybe more Ukrainian than we realized, at least at the local level. So I think paying attention to those narratives gives us a sense of like thinking about the power dynamics of belonging that are in migration policies. And then in terms of, I think I definitely bring this sensitivity to race as an American anthropologist coming from the United States, as other people in this series have brought up. When I presented my initial findings in Russia in 2017, people did not see the Compatriots program in terms of race. People felt that this idea of looking at race was foreign and we don't use this language. But I think it is something to think about and to be aware of the differences, as well as we're mentoring students and thinking about the kind of fieldwork we're doing. As someone, people tended to interpret me as ethnic Russian, which made my fieldwork among officials easier. As I was waiting in line at various offices, I wasn't, I would get kind of pulled up in line for various reasons. And so I think like reflecting on that and how that shapes not only the questions we're asking, but the kinds of field work we're able to do is important to reflect on in research and methods training.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you so much. I think there are a few questions that are specifically about BLM. And again, I'll just reiterate, there will be an entire panel on the responses to BLM in Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia next Friday. So I would just point viewers who are interested to next week's seminar. But then also, I think we can group a couple of questions that have to do, Sean, with your presentation, because there was one question that asks, a question by Whitney Brown, how has the classification of terrorist groups affected the trajectory of change that racial minorities are pushing for?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I don't look at it only as terrorist groups, but the fallout of the global war on terror. I think that the global war on terror itself is kind of pregnant with a certain racism. And in some ways, the corrective that the Obama administration took to reclassify it as violent extremism or Islamic extremism only exacerbated that, because then you get more and more people, and I think this speaks to some of what Monica's talking about as well, that identify Islam as inherently extreme, right? But I also think that in some ways I've thought about this in general because I'm interested in non-state, ethnic groups without statehood. And I think the global war on terror has really been a boon for states in terms of further burying any ethnic groups without statehood. You know, it's like the idea of self-determination, I think, has taken a real hard hit in the war on terror, as various states kind of use that discourse as a means to attack self-determination movements.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. And I think there is another question, since you just spoke, maybe could you briefly address the question of by Joseph Matvienko, is Chinese policy toward ethnic Kazakhs and other Muslim minorities different from the treatment of Uyghurs?
Yeah, well, so what's interesting about the situation in the Uyghur region of China, which the Chinese government calls Xinjiang, which means new territory or new frontier, which kind of belies its colonial roots. The Muslims in that region have been undergoing the same oppression as the Uyghurs. So these mass internment centers that they've put Uyghurs in, they've also put Kazakhs and, you know, it could be Tatars, Uzbeks, a lot of the Central Asian peoples would fall, you know, they would befall the same fate. However, it's an interesting question. There's a very large Muslim ethnic group in China called the Huizu, which in Central Asia are referred to as Dungan. And that population is facing increased scrutiny, but not to the same extent. You know, and I think that that's one of the interesting things. I think somebody asked about the Huizu as well. You know, I think when we think about whiteness, you know, as kind of power asserted against a racially profiled or ethnically profiled minority, there are gradations of how different minorities in any society feel that. I mean, we certainly see that in the US, but you know, you see the same thing in China where, yes, you know, Huizu are also discriminated against, but they're not being put in mass internment camps.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there was another question that is technically addressed to you, but I think it could be an interesting bridge from you to Monica and Monica's research. And it specifically, it's Jeta or Yeta, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce correctly, Luboteni. What similarities do you see to the denial of genocide in East Turkestan and Yugoslavia? Is Islamophobia a factor? But I actually kind of want to latch on to the Yugoslavia part here. And Monica, as you were saying so forcefully about the issues surrounding Polish attitudes toward Muslim citizens, subjects, I wonder whether the Yugoslavian very recent wars have any impact. I mean, the countries are really very, very close to each other. I'm talking about Bosnia specifically, of course. But like in the larger European context, it's not like Central and Western Europe do not have Muslim populations, right? Mm-hmm. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, who is answering the question?
You. And yeah. If Sean wants to chime in, he absolutely can.
Okay. Well, I think Yugoslavia is, I mean, because there is something interesting when we talk about this attitude towards Muslims, you know, and that was also part of my research, to draw attention to the fact that it is only in a very specific circumstances that people who happen to be related to Islam are labeled as Muslims exclusively. Yeah, and that is something very something omitted, something considered transparent, and I consider that very important. And I think this reference to Yugoslavia is less symptomatic than a reference to another group of Muslims who were not coded in Poland as Muslims, and I mean here Chechnya, refugees from Chechnya in the 90s. and this is very interesting comparison, because in the 90s we had, it is estimated that nearly 100 people from Chechnya passed through Poland as refugees. And what is interesting is the fact that even though they were Muslims, they were not coded as Muslims. It was not a problem. It was basically that they are escaping from the war against Russia, and they were welcome. There was no this Islamophobic hysteria at this particular time. So they were not coded as Muslims, as those people, for example, escaping from Syria, yeah, during the refugee crisis, were suddenly reduced to their Muslimness. And again, it is very interesting if you think about the very fact what is occluded in this kind of coding some people. Because when you think about the socialist time, and when you think about the time when we had those links with different non-European countries, countries of the third world, including Arab countries, there was this political cooperation. We had a lot of students from Arab countries coming to Poland as part of politically motivated, building those links, etc., etc. And those students were coming to Poland from Syria, from Egypt, from Algeria. Yeah, they were living here, but they were never coded as Muslims. Very often they were probably, I don't know, atheist, socialist, whatever, yeah, at this particular time. But Poland had this experience of political cooperation with, for example, Arab countries, which were never coded as Muslim countries. And now suddenly they are just reduced to their Muslimness. Yeah. So I think this is also a very interesting issue, how different coding on different minorities is changing. What kind of factors are considered crucial? Yeah. And this comparison with Chechnya people and with this total, people forgot the socialist period and presence of Arab students and completely different perception of them.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, there are several questions still unanswered. Most of them are for you, Monika, and if you can just maybe continue a little bit and elaborate on this point, but also including the Poland versus Hungary. And because the question specifically is, do you think the Huntingtonian concept of conflict of civilization influences present-day European Islamophobia? But the question begins with, how would you compare Islamophobia in Poland and Hungary?
Well, you see, there were different political circumstances in 2015. Yeah, because Hungary, there was this issue with real groups of refugees in Budapest, in Hungary, etc. We did not have that. Yeah, so that was one of the differences. But yes, there is a lot of similarities in the sense how Islamophobia is intertwined with nationalist discourse. There are very interesting commonalities when you think how different Islamophobic discourses are sometimes linked to anti-Semitism. And in both cases, there was this anti-Soros discourse. In Poland, we had this conception that it is George Soros who's basically pushing for this refugee, allocation. So, this kind of anti-Semitic statements were somehow incorporated in anti-refugee discourse. And I think something similar was happening in Hungary. So, yeah, and well, that was also the talk about protection of Christian identity. However, I think it is very different if you look more closely at the position of religion in Poland and Hungary. Still, I mean, if you look at the strength of Catholic Church in Poland, if you look at institutional role of Catholic Church in spreading Islamophobia, obviously you had some voices within the church that were trying to be Christian more than Polish Catholic, in the sense that we should be open to people in need. Yeah, but still, very strong voice within institutional Catholic Church was highly Islamophobic, was promoting this Christianity versus Islam vision of history. Yeah, and I think that's the factor that is different in Hungary, even though Orban is referring explicitly to religious factor as well. Yeah, but still institutionally, and if you think about the how the society, to what extent is identifying with Catholic Church in Poland and Hungary, there is a significant difference. Yeah? So, you know, the political circumstances, the fact that refugees came to Hungary and did not come to Poland, it's the difference. Yeah? And the role of Catholic Church is different, but many similarities, yes, as well. Yeah, like open racism. Yeah, something, you know, this gradual crossing the borders that you could observe in the course of 2015. Yeah, like every week was bringing some transgressions of something that you could think were standards in talking about people. Yeah, so I think some similar things you could observe, yes, in Hungary and Poland in this regard. Yeah.
Thank you. And as you were answering, you also answered another question that had to do with the relationship between the Catholic Church and in Poland and this notion of whiteness. We really only have a couple of minutes left, but there is a question that is, again, technically addressed, Monica, to you, but I wonder whether perhaps Marius or Lauren or Sean could also chime in with, so it's Bolaji, again, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing names, Balogun. The question is, surely there are gaps in the understanding of race, whiteness, and between the East and the West, though that dichotomy in itself is, of course, fairly controversial. In what ways can we bridge these gaps, if at all possible? I wonder whether there are similarities / differences about whiteness in Poland or any other country of our region, and the kinds of whiteness in the West. And just going back to my introductory remarks, I was also wondering, just in terms of what does whiteness illuminate and what does it obfuscate, really, and as a framework, when is it useful and when not? So as part of closing comments, I was wondering whether maybe each of you could say a few things about the two, kind of the Anglo-American context versus Central European, East European, Russian, Central Asian.
Okay, you want me to
Marius,
start?
go ahead, you go first.
I want to thank all of those who asked questions, and I answered in an extremely speedy manner in the Q&A, so which gave me a moment of respite, I suppose, as I was not asked any questions. So thank you to all of you. I appreciate you taking the time to ask a question. Now, regarding Bolaji's question, I would argue that in East Central Europe, whiteness functions as a synecdoche for something much bigger, implicitly, and that you have to excavate that, whether you talk about the nation or you talk about religion or you talk about forms of Islamophobia as it happens in Poland. Whilst in the West, of course, whiteness is either assumed or critiqued or rejected on certain more explicit principles. So immediately you could have that kind of discussion about the differences. But as Bolaji certainly knows, as he's worked on this for many years now, there are certain similarities, which I think questions a bit the whole idea about Eastern Europe as a periphery and Eastern Europe as a place out there that is basically a recipient, a skip where you just drop your ideas. I think there is more to question here in terms of the local traditions and the similarities that actually more or less simultaneous. There is a synchronicity almost in certain areas that so far as alluded the scholars. Monica has been explaining this very well when she talked about religion. If you look at Catholic racism in Poland and Hungary, the synchronicity with the West is almost identical. There's no difference, there's no East and West when it comes to the Catholic anti-Semitism or the Catholic racism that works in the 19th century and 20th century. They work on completely different planes. So yes, there are differences, there are similarities, but like I said, I suppose, and this panel demonstrated very clearly, it all depends how you want to, grab the bull by its horns.
Yeah, Lauren, would you like to add something to this? Also, as a manner of kind of completely wrapping up, we're essentially out of time.
Yes. So I think just to quickly respond, I think, as people have mentioned, whiteness as well as race are not the terms that people in Russia are using. They're talking about, as Marius mentioned in the context he looks at, people are talking about differences in terms of nationality. And I think in order to try to understand what whiteness might look like and the hierarchies and power relations embedded in these national differences, I think it's important to look at the specific practices people are engaging in when they try to identify someone by nationality, for example, and what kind of work that is. And I think, that's something that you see in the American context as well, if someone kind of asks someone, where are you from? And as if they're a foreigner, they're like, oh, I'm from Philadelphia. But then the follow-up question is, no, but where are you from? And so I think engaging those questions and looking at the signs people are pointing to think comparatively is important.
And in a blitz fashion, Sean and then Monica, if you don't mind.
Sure. So first of all, I think, the American conception of race is very, very particular. I think I've been kind of fascinated by it as an anthropologist, even though I don't really study American culture, just the obsession with having to put yourself in a racial box. I think the US is one of the only places that really does that on a nationwide level. But I think that really these concepts are so locally embedded. Just very quickly, I remember when I was teaching at the University of Southern California, and I was teaching about ethnicity and nationalism, a student came up to me almost in tears saying, I don't have an ethnicity, I'm only white. And which points out the difference also from the East Coast to the West Coast of America with these categories. But I think that for me, it really comes down to this differentiation of power. And, there's been so much research on identity of the importance of the other in terms of reaffirming the self. So, in all of these contexts, and Monica talks about this, I think, very well with the case of Poland, a lot of understanding the way Poles see Muslims is about the way Poles see themselves.
Thank you. Monica, the last word is yours.
Yeah, well, when I think about whiteness in Polish context, it is a kind of a problem experienced not directly. I mean, it has not been directly experienced in Polish culture and Polish history. That's the fact. Yeah, so that's it is important to relate it to the centers, where the structure of racial hierarchy with whiteness at the top was constructed. But so in this sense, you can say that in Eastern European context in Poland, whiteness is very often an aspiration, explicitly stated aspiration. You could see that in political ideologies that emphasize whiteness against others in constructing Polishness. But whiteness is one thing. Another thing is discussion about race, because we've had a lot of issues with race, a lot of processes of racializations that operated differently than in other contexts. And obviously, one of the main focus of all those discussions about racism in Poland is anti-Semitism. That's a huge issue, which has been central for centuries. I mean, at least like if you look at 19th century, 20th century, and now is reenacted in different forms in all those discussions related to Polish complicity in the Holocaust, for example. If you follow the discussions on the Holocaust scholarship in Poland right now and historical, so-called historical politics, yeah, this kind of issues with anti-Semitism are like central for the public discussion now. Yeah, so in this sense, race and the heritage of races, Polish races, is probably that's the issue which is central, really. In Polish context, yeah, and it also, and in my view, I mean, if you want to get this picture of whiteness, how it is constructed, and that's basically the objective of my current research, is that we have to really reconstruct these matrices of racialization and look at the connections, how, I don't know, relation to non-European others, developed in Polish culture is related to the history of anti-Semitism, how it is related to the racialization in the context of class relations. And if you look further in history to this nobility peasant relations, yeah, all those things I think create like a matrix that is at the basis of what it means to refer to whiteness now in the Polish context. Yeah, so that's what I'm trying to do in my current research, really, which is called genealogy of peripheral whiteness. You know, genealogy. So I'm looking for this kind of roots of the phenomenon. You know.
Thank you, Monika. Thank you, the entire panel. I think, Monika, this image of matrices of racialization is quite potent, and I look forward to reading your research as it develops. My apologies if we weren't able to answer every question or every question as fully as you would have liked. I am sure the panelists wouldn't mind if you reach out to them via email. But for now, thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you to the panelists and their great research. Thank you for the Center for Russian East European Studies at the University of Pittsburgh for hosting this webinar. And again, remember, there is another great webinar happening next week on the BLM responses in our region.